May 12, 1945, 1:20 in the morning, somewhere in the Burmese jungle near the Irrawaddy River. 3 Gurkha riflemen crouched in a forward trench listening. Through the monsoon rain and thick undergrowth, they could hear them coming. Footsteps, whispers, the metallic click of weapons. At least 200 Japanese soldiers were creeping through the darkness toward their position. Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung, just 27 years old and barely 4 feet 11 inches tall, gripped his Lee Enfield rifle. His hands were steady, but he knew what was coming. This wasn't a patrol. This wasn't a probe. This was a full assault, and his trench was directly in its path. His post was the most forward position of the entire British defensive line. If it fell, the Japanese would roll up the flank and slaughter 2 companies of surrounded Gurkhas. Everything depended on this one trench. Everything depended on 3 men, and in less than 2 minutes, only one of them would still be fighting. This is the story of what happened when that one man refused to die. To understand what happened in that trench, we need to go back to December 1917, to a tiny village in the hills of Nepal called Dahakani. Lachhiman Gurung was born into poverty. His father, Partiman Gurung, was a farmer, like his father before him and his father before that. They worked a small plot of land in the shadow of the Himalayas, barely enough to feed the family. Life was hard. Opportunities were scarce. For young men in these mountains, there were essentially 2 paths: farm like your father, or leave. But there was a third option that had existed for over a century: join the British Indian Army as a Gurkha. Since 1815, when the British East India Company first recruited Nepali soldiers after fighting against them, Gurkhas had built a reputation that terrified enemies across the globe. The word Gurkha itself comes from the Gorkhali warriors of the Kingdom of Gurkha, who had unified Nepal in the 18th century. The British had fought them in the Anglo-Nepalese War and were so impressed by their ferocity and skill that they decided, if we can't beat them, recruit them. And so began one of the most remarkable military partnerships in history. Gurkhas served Britain in every major conflict: the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the 2 Afghan Wars, the Boxer Rebellion in China, and both World Wars. Everywhere they went, their reputation grew. German soldiers in World War I called them the Devil's Own. They feared the kukri, the curved knife every Gurkha carried, and they feared the men who wielded them even more. Stories spread of Gurkhas sneaking into enemy trenches at night, killing sentries silently, leaving only bodies and terror behind. Young Lachhiman Gurung grew up hearing these stories. In his village, Gurkha veterans were treated like heroes. They came home with medals, with stories, with money. They had seen the world. They had proven themselves. They were living legends. But there was a problem. To join the Gurkhas, you had to meet strict requirements. You had to pass brutal physical tests. You had to demonstrate courage, endurance, and skill. And you had to be at least 5 feet tall. Lachhiman Gurung stood 4 feet 11 inches, 1 inch too short.
Under normal circumstances, he would have been rejected immediately and sent back to his village to farm. But circumstances in 1940 were anything but normal.
By December 1940, when Lachhiman Gurung walked to the British recruitment station, the world was on fire. In Europe, Nazi Germany controlled everything from France to Poland. Britain stood alone, enduring nightly bombing raids on London. In Asia, Japan had already invaded China and was preparing to sweep through Southeast Asia like a tsunami. The British Empire was desperate for soldiers, everywhere, immediately. Height requirements? They could be flexible. When Gurung stood before the recruiting officer, the man looked at him for a long moment. 4 feet 11. Technically, too short. But there was something in the young man's eyes. Determination. Fire. The officer made a note in his ledger. Acceptable. Just like that, Lachhiman Gurung's life changed forever. He joined the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, one of the most decorated regiments in the British Indian Army. The date was December 13, 1940. He was 23 years old. There's a story, possibly embellished, possibly true, about how it happened. According to this version, Gurung's father sent him to the village store to buy cigarettes. On the way, he ran into a friend who was heading to enlist. They went together. Gurung never came home with those cigarettes. He simply disappeared into the army. His father wouldn't see him again for 5 years. When Lachhiman finally returned to that village, he would be missing an eye and most of his right hand. But he would be carrying the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration for gallantry. His father would get the full story of what happened to the cigarettes and everything else. Gurung's training was intense. The Gurkhas didn't accept weak soldiers. Physical conditioning was brutal. Long marches through mountains carrying full kit, hand-to-hand combat, weapons training, and endless drilling in the scorching Indian sun. He learned to handle the Lee-Enfield rifle, the standard British infantry weapon. 10 rounds in the magazine, bolt action, accurate up to 600 yards in trained hands. The Gurkhas could fire 15 aimed shots per minute, faster than most soldiers could manage. Gurung practiced until loading and firing became automatic, muscle memory, something he could do without thinking. He also learned the Gurkha code. It wasn't written down, it was lived. Aggression in attack, stubbornness in defense, loyalty to your brothers, never surrender, never retreat unless ordered, fight to the last man and the last round, and above all else, better to die than be a coward. These weren't just words. This was identity. This was what separated Gurkhas from every other regiment. When things got desperate, when retreat seemed like the only rational option, Gurkhas stayed. They fought. They died if necessary, but they never quit. By 1944, Gurung had completed his training and been deployed with his battalion. His destination, Burma, one of the most brutal, forgotten theaters of World War II. A place where more soldiers died of disease than bullets. A place where the enemy showed no mercy. A place where Lachhiman Gurung would become a legend. The Burma Campaign was hell, not metaphorically, literally. If you could design a perfect environment to kill soldiers, you would create Burma in 1944. The terrain was almost impassable. Thick jungle where visibility rarely exceeded 20 yards. Mountains that seemed to go straight up. Rivers that flooded during monsoon season, washing away bridges and roads. Swamps where men could sink to their waists in mud. Then there were the diseases. Malaria killed thousands. So did dysentery, typhus, and dozens of tropical diseases British doctors had never even seen before. Men would be fine one day, dead from fever 3 days later. Entire companies were incapacitated, not by combat, but by mosquitoes and contaminated water. And then there was the enemy. The Imperial Japanese Army had conquered most of Southeast Asia in an astonishing campaign in 1942. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, they'd swept through everything. They seemed unstoppable. Japanese soldiers fought with a fanaticism that shocked British and Indian forces. They had been trained to view surrender as the ultimate disgrace. Captured enemies were tortured and executed. Wounded Japanese soldiers would detonate grenades when Allied troops approached, killing themselves and anyone nearby. Officers who failed were expected to commit suicide. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was doctrine. The Japanese military code, Bushido as interpreted by imperial propaganda, demanded absolute loyalty to the emperor, contempt for weakness, and death before dishonor. POW camps run by the Japanese were death camps. The Burma Railway, where prisoners built a railway through the jungle, killed over 100,000 laborers. So when British and Indian forces fought the Japanese in Burma, they knew there would be no mercy. Surrender meant torture and death. The only option was to win or die fighting. The Gurkhas and the Japanese were oddly matched opponents. Both had warrior traditions going back centuries. Both valued courage above life. Both would rather die than retreat. When Gurkhas and Japanese soldiers met in combat, it was often hand-to-hand, kukri against bayonet, neither side giving an inch. By early 1944, the tide was slowly turning. The British and Indian forces had stopped Japan's advance into India at the battles of Imphal and Kohima, some of the most savage fighting of the entire war. Now they were pushing back, slowly, painfully, driving the Japanese out of Burma. Operation Extended Capital was the code name for the Allied offensive to recapture central Burma and cut off Japanese supply lines. The 8th Gurkha Rifles were right in the middle of it. Gurung's battalion fought through swamps, across rivers, up jungle-covered mountains. Every advance meant ambushes. Every hill meant Japanese defenders who would die rather than surrender. Gurung saw combat. He learned what real war looked like. Not the training exercises in India, but actual killing. Friends dying, bodies rotting in the heat, the smell of death that never left, the exhaustion that made men fall asleep standing up, the constant vigilance because a moment's inattention meant a sniper's bullet or a hidden grenade. He proved himself in dozens of small actions, skirmishes, patrols, defensive positions. His officers noted that he was reliable, brave, skilled with his rifle, a good soldier, not special, not remarkable, just competent and courageous, like thousands of other Gurkhas. Nothing in his record suggested he was different from his brothers in arms. Nothing suggested that in a few months he would do something that would enter military legend, something that would earn him the Victoria Cross, something that would seem impossible to anyone who heard the story. But that moment was coming. It was coming very fast.
By May 1945, the Japanese position in Burma was collapsing. The Allies had crossed the Irrawaddy River, a major psychological and strategic blow. Rangoon, the capital, would fall within days, but the Japanese weren't beaten. Not yet. Scattered Japanese units were trying desperately to break out of encirclement. Thousands of soldiers were retreating south, trying to escape the closing trap before they were cut off completely. These weren't organized withdrawals. These were desperate, chaotic movements of men who knew they were running out of time. Desperate men are dangerous. The Japanese forces retreating through central Burma in May 1945 knew they were likely going to die. They were hungry, exhausted, running low on ammunition, but they would fight anyone who tried to stop them. They would attack with everything they had. They had nothing to lose. On May 9, 1945, the 4th Battalion of the 8th Gurkha Rifles received orders. Move to the area around Taugdao, near the Irrawaddy River, and block Japanese withdrawal routes. Intelligence reported enemy forces moving through the area. Exact numbers unknown, exact position unknown. Just, they're coming. Be ready. The terrain around Taugdao was typical Burma jungle, dense, wet, miserable. Visibility was limited to a few dozen yards in most directions. The monsoon rains had started early that year, turning everything into mud. Trenches filled with water as fast as soldiers could dig them. The Gurkhas dug defensive positions on a reverse slope, a hillside that gave them some advantage. They created overlapping fields of fire, cleared undergrowth to improve visibility, positioned machine guns to cover likely approach routes. Standard defensive tactics from the manual. But the jungle limited what they could see. The Japanese were masters of infiltration. They could get close before being spotted. They specialized in night attacks, moving silently through darkness, overrunning positions before defenders could react effectively. C Company of the 4th Battalion was assigned to defend a key section of the perimeter. Within C Company, Gurung's section, just a few men, was given the most forward position, a trench about 100 yards ahead of the main defensive line. This was the worst position in the entire defensive perimeter. It would be hit first, it would be hardest to reinforce, it would be most likely to be overrun. The men in that forward trench weren't expected to stop an attack. They were expected to provide early warning and delay the enemy long enough for the main line to prepare. It was, essentially, a suicide post, and Lachhiman Gurung was one of 3 men assigned to it. His section commander was Naik Devbasing Bura, a more experienced soldier, who would later write the Victoria Cross recommendation. Burma positioned his men carefully, made sure everyone knew the plan, checked ammunition and grenades, improved the trench as much as possible. Gurung and the other 2 riflemen in that forward trench prepared as well as they could. They deepened the trench walls, they piled sandbags, they placed extra ammunition within easy reach. You don't want to be searching for bullets in the dark during an attack. They positioned grenades on the trench parapet where they could grab them quickly. Gurung also placed his kukri knife on the parapet, blade gleaming dully in the fading light. The curved knife was more than a weapon. It was a symbol. Every Gurkha carried one. Every Gurkha knew how to use it. If the Japanese got close enough, he would need it. That night, May 12, 1945, the men stood to in their trenches as darkness fell. Intelligence reports were vague but ominous. Japanese forces were definitely in the area. They might attack tonight, they might attack tomorrow. They might bypass this position entirely. No one knew for sure. Gurung settled into his position and waited. The jungle was never silent. Insects, birds, the occasional rustle of animals moving through undergrowth. Rain dripped from leaves, water pooled in the bottom of the trench. Everything was wet, cold, miserable. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Men fought to stay alert. In the darkness, every sound seemed threatening. Was that footstep? Was that a branch breaking? Or just the jungle? At 1:20 in the morning, the waiting ended. Naik Burma had just gotten all his men to stand to in their trenches, which probably saved their lives, because seconds later, the grenades started falling. The Japanese had found them, and they were coming.
Naik Devbasing Burra was in his trench, a few yards behind Gurung's forward position, when he saw the first grenade arc through the darkness. It landed just outside Gurung's trench. Most soldiers would have ducked, covered, braced for the explosion. Gurung did something else. He scooped it up and threw it back. The explosion lit up the jungle for a split second and revealed the nightmare advancing toward them. Dozens of Japanese soldiers, maybe more, rushing forward through the undergrowth, screaming, firing, more grenades already in the air. Burma watched in disbelief as a second grenade fell directly into Gurung's trench. Again, Gurung grabbed it and hurled it at the attackers. It detonated in mid-air, the blast visible through the rain, bodies falling. But there were too many of them. They kept coming, wave after wave, emerging from the darkness like demons. This wasn't a probe, this wasn't a small unit. This was a full assault, at least 200 Japanese soldiers hitting one section of the defensive line. And they were all converging on Gurung's forward trench, the key to the entire position. If they took it, they would roll up the flank, surround C Company, massacre everyone. A third grenade arced through the darkness. Gurung saw it coming, falling directly at his feet. He bent down, fingers closing around the metal casing. But this grenade had a shorter fuse. Or maybe it had been thrown from closer. Or maybe God had decided this was the moment to test how much courage one man possessed. The grenade exploded in his hand. The blast was catastrophic. Gurung felt his right hand disappear, not gradually, not in stages, but instantly. One moment he had fingers, palm, a working hand. The next moment, nothing. Just torn flesh, shattered bone, blood pouring. Shrapnel ripped into his face. His right eye burst from the impact. Pain exploded through his head as metal fragments tore through soft tissue. His right arm, chest, face were covered in burns from the blast. More shrapnel hit his legs. The force threw him backward against the trench wall. For a moment, maybe a second, maybe longer, everything went white. Pain beyond description, shock hitting his system, his brain trying to process catastrophic damage. The other 2 Gurkhas in the trench were hit by the same explosion. All 3 men wounded, bleeding, disoriented, and 200 Japanese soldiers were seconds away from overrunning their position. This was the moment any rational soldier would have retreated, would have fallen back to the main line, would have sought medical attention. Survival instinct demanded it, training suggested it, common sense screamed for it. The other 2 Gurkhas in the trench were too badly wounded to fight. They tried, but they couldn't. They needed help, needed medical attention, needed evacuation. Which meant Gurung was alone, wounded beyond what most men could survive, half blind, missing most of his right hand, bleeding from dozens of wounds, facing 200 enemy soldiers who were screaming, charging, throwing more grenades, seconds away from overwhelming his position. Any other soldier in any other army would have died here, would have surrendered, would have accepted defeat. The math was simple. One wounded man cannot stop 200 attackers. It's impossible. The laws of physics, the laws of combat, the laws of reality said, you lose, give up, die quickly. Lachhiman Gurung looked at his destroyed hand. He looked at the Japanese soldiers rushing toward him through the darkness, and he made a decision. He grabbed his rifle with his left hand, and he started killing.
The Lee Enfield rifle was designed for right-handed use. The stock fits against the right shoulder. The trigger is pulled with the right index finger. Most importantly, the bolt action, which must be cycled after every shot to eject the spent cartridge and load a new round, is on the right side of the weapon. It requires the right hand. Gurung's right hand was destroyed, useless, gone. So he improvised. He braced the rifle against his left hip. He worked the bolt with his left hand, reaching across his body, pulling back, pushing forward, a motion that was awkward, slow, nothing like proper technique. He aimed with his one remaining eye, his vision halved, depth perception gone. And he fired. The first Japanese soldier fell. The second. The third. The Japanese soldiers expected to find dead or dying defenders. They expected to overrun the trench in seconds, clear the position, and push through to the main British line. What they found instead was a Gurkha who was shooting back, accurately, rapidly, killing the lead attackers, and screaming at them. "Come and fight a Gurkha," he yelled in Gurkhali. "Come on, come and fight." The shock of it stopped the Japanese advance cold for precious seconds, long enough for Gurung to kill several more soldiers, long enough for confusion to ripple through the Japanese ranks. They outnumbered him 50-1. They had every advantage. Why was this wounded man still fighting? Why wasn't he dead? The attackers adjusted. More grenades fell into and around Gurung's trench. He couldn't throw them back. His right hand was useless. All he could do was press himself against the trench wall, let the explosions wash over him, take more shrapnel wounds, more burns, and keep firing. The Japanese tried rushing the position. Gurung shot them down, one after another. Bodies piled up in front of his trench. The dead became obstacles that slowed the living. From his position behind Gurung, Naik Devbasing Bura watched in disbelief. He had seen combat before. He had seen Gurkhas fight with incredible courage, but this was something beyond normal courage. This was a wounded man who should have been incapacitated, fighting with the effectiveness of a full-strength squad. Bura tried to send men forward to reinforce Gurung's position. The Japanese fire was too intense. Anyone who tried to reach that forward trench would be cut down before covering half the distance. Machine gun fire swept the ground between the positions. Grenades exploded continuously. Bullets snapped through the air like angry hornets. So Gurung fought alone. One man, one eye, one hand, against 200 Japanese soldiers who were determined to break through his position. The physical challenges were almost incomprehensible. The Lee Enfield rifle weighs 9 pounds, heavier when wet with rain and mud. Holding it steady with one hand while working the bolt with that same hand required strength Gurung didn't know he had. Working the bolt action one-handed while aiming and firing required coordination and practice that Gurung had never trained for. He had to 1. Fire. 2. Shift his left hand to trigger to bolt. 3. Bolt back to eject spent cartridge. 4. Push bolt forward to chamber new round. 5. Shift hand back to trigger. 6. Re-aim with his one remaining eye. 7. Fire again. All of this in darkness.
while under fire, while bleeding from dozens of wounds, while Japanese soldiers were trying to kill him every single second. He learned it in real time. His first few shots were slow, awkward, but muscle memory took over. His body adapted. His left hand moved faster, smoother, more efficiently. Load, fire. Load, fire. Load, fire. The pain must have been excruciating. The destroyed hand sent agony shooting up his arm with every movement. The ruined eye throbbed. Shrapnel embedded in his body felt like knives with every breath. Burns covered his skin. He was bleeding heavily. Combat injuries produce shock. The body shuts down non-essential functions to preserve the brain and heart. Vision narrows, hearing becomes muffled, strength fades. Most soldiers pass out from trauma far less severe than what Gurung was enduring. But Gurung stayed conscious through sheer willpower. He had a job: hold the trench, stop the Japanese, protect his brothers in arms. Everything was secondary, including his own survival. The Japanese couldn't understand what was happening. Nothing in their training or experience had prepared them for this. They outnumbered the defenders massively. They were attacking the weakest point in the British line. They had surprise and momentum. One wounded Gurkha was stopping their entire assault. Officers tried to rally their men, push forward, overrun that cursed trench. Every attempt met the same result: rifle fire, dead soldiers, that voice screaming defiance from the forward position. Come and fight a Gurkha. The attackers changed tactics. They tried flanking the trench, approaching from multiple angles. Gurung shifted his fire, covered each approach. The jungle terrain limited the angles of attack. The narrow front meant the Japanese couldn't bring overwhelming force to bear all at once. They had to approach through killing zones. And Gurung covered every single one.
Time became meaningless. The battle was a continuous roar of gunfire, explosions, and screaming. Gurung fired until his rifle was empty, 10 rounds gone in less than a minute. Then came the most vulnerable moment: reloading. Normally, a soldier reloads with both hands in seconds. One hand holds the rifle, the other strips a 5-round charger clip from the pouch, guides it into the magazine, pushes the rounds down, removes the clip, closes the bolt. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. One-handed, it took much longer. Gurung had to prop the rifle against the trench wall, fumble for a charger clip with his left hand in the darkness, guide it into the magazine by feel. If he dropped it, he'd have to search in the mud for loose rounds. Push down on 5 rounds with his thumb while his destroyed right hand hung useless. Pick up the rifle again, chamber around, get back into firing position. Every second of reloading was a second the Japanese could advance. Every second was life or death. Gurung learned to reload faster, developed a rhythm, placed his ammunition pouches in easier positions, felt for the charger clips without looking, got the rifle back into action and started firing again. The process repeated hundreds of times through the night. Fire 10 rounds, reload. Fire 10 more, reload. Each reload under fire. Each reload with Japanese soldiers trying to kill him. Each reload with his vision fading, his strength ebbing, his blood draining into the mud. The Japanese threw more grenades. Gurung couldn't avoid them all. More shrapnel wounds, more pain. But pain was irrelevant now. His entire existence had narrowed to a single point: hold the trench. Everything else, the injuries, the exhaustion, the fear, was background noise. Blood loss was weakening him. He could feel it. His movements were slower.
His vision was failing, not just from the destroyed eye, but from shock and blood loss. The edges of his vision were going dark. He knew what that meant. He was dying. But the Japanese were still attacking. If he stopped fighting, they would break through. His brothers would die. The entire C Company would be massacred. That thought was unacceptable. So he fired another round, and another, and another. Around 2 a.m., his ammunition situation became critical. Gurung had started the battle with his basic load, 50 rounds in his ammunition pouches, 10 in his rifle magazine, 60 rounds total. He had been firing steadily for 40 minutes. How many shots had he taken? He had no idea. He just knew his pouches felt lighter. Each shot had to count now. He couldn't waste rounds on uncertain targets, but he also couldn't let the Japanese close the distance. It was a razor's edge calculation. Shoot enough to keep them at bay, conserve enough to keep fighting until dawn or reinforcements arrived.
He felt for cartridges in his pouches. Not many left. Maybe enough for one more major attack. Maybe not. He didn't think about what would happen when the ammunition ran out. He just kept firing until the rifle was empty, then reloaded, then fired again. At 3 in the morning, the intensity of the Japanese attack suddenly increased. This wasn't desperation. This was a coordinated push. Officers had rallied their men for one major attempt to break through before dawn. They came at Gurung's position from multiple angles simultaneously. Grenades rained down. Machine gun fire swept his trench. Rifle fire came from 3 directions at once. Japanese soldiers rushed forward, accepting casualties, determined to overrun that single defended position that had stopped them for nearly 2 hours. Gurung met them with the same response: rifle fire, controlled, accurate, relentless. He was operating on pure instinct now. His training was so deeply ingrained that his body executed the motions without conscious thought. Aim, fire, cycle bolt, aim, fire. His left hand moved automatically. His one remaining eye tracked targets. His rifle spoke again and again. Japanese soldiers fell. The assault broke against his trench like a wave against a cliff. By 4 a.m., the Japanese attacks were losing momentum. The officers couldn't rally their men for another push. Too many casualties. Too many bodies in front of that cursed trench. Too much fear of the unseen demon who wouldn't die and wouldn't stop killing. The attackers pulled back, regrouped, tried to figure out what to do. They still outnumbered the defenders massively, but mass didn't matter if they couldn't bring it to bear. And bringing it to bear meant advancing through Gurung's killing zone. No one wanted to be the next soldier to die in front of that trench. Gurung used the lull to take stock. He was barely conscious. Blood loss and shock were taking their toll. His right hand, what remained of it, hung useless. His right eye was destroyed. Shrapnel wounds covered his body. Every movement brought fresh agony. He felt for cartridges in his pouches. Not many. Maybe enough for one more attack. Maybe not. He had no idea how much time had passed. It felt like hours, but also like minutes. Time had lost meaning in the darkness and chaos. He didn't think about medical attention, didn't think about evacuation, didn't think about the Victoria Cross or medals or glory. He just watched the darkness, waited for the next assault, and kept his rifle ready. Behind him, the rest of C Company was holding their positions. They could hear the battle at Gurung's trench, the continuous gunfire, the explosions, the screaming. They tried to provide supporting fire, but the darkness and jungle limited what they could do. Naik Bura reported the situation to his company commander. One rifleman holding the forward post alone, heavily wounded, still fighting, stopping an entire Japanese assault. The commander didn't believe it at first. It was impossible. One man couldn't do what Bura was describing. Then the commander listened to the pattern of fire. Single rifle shots, controlled, precise, coming from that forward position, still holding, still fighting. It was true. One man was doing the impossible. Reinforcements couldn't reach Gurung. The Japanese controlled the ground between his trench and the main line. Any relief attempt would be wiped out before covering half the distance, so Gurung stayed alone, outnumbered, wounded, running out of ammunition, but still holding. The Japanese had committed their entire force to breaking through this one point. They had failed. One man had stopped them, a man who, by every rational assessment, should have been dead in the first minutes of combat. As dawn approached, around 5 a.m., the sky began to lighten imperceptibly. The Japanese knew what dawn meant. Allied aircraft would spot them. Artillery would find their positions. Staying in the open after sunrise meant death from above. They tried one final assault. This was desperation. They needed to break through now before daylight, before it was too late. They gathered their remaining strength, their remaining courage, and charged Gurung's position one more time. Screaming, firing everything they had, accepting that many would die, believing that sheer numbers would finally overwhelm that single defender. This was it, the final roll of the dice. Lachhiman Gurung met them with his last rounds of ammunition. He fired until the rifle was empty. Click! No more ammunition. The rifle was useless now. Just 9 pounds of wood and metal. He could hear them coming, closer now. He could see their shadows in the pre-dawn light. They were going to reach his trench. This was the end. Gurung put down his empty rifle. He grabbed his kukri knife from the parapet. The curved blade gleamed in the faint light. If the Japanese reached his trench, he would kill them with steel. One-handed, half-blind, bleeding out. He would fight with the knife until they killed him or he killed them all. Better to die than be a coward. But the Japanese assault broke before reaching his trench. The final charge faltered. The lead attackers fell, to Gurung's last shots, to machine gun fire from the main British line, to their own exhaustion and fear. The survivors pulled back into the jungle. Dawn was breaking. The darkness that had concealed them was fading. The sky was turning gray, then pink. Staying meant being caught in the open, being slaughtered by Allied aircraft and artillery. The Japanese withdrew. They melted back into the jungle, left their dead behind, retreated from a position they should have overrun in minutes. The attack was over. Lachhiman Gurung had held. For 4 hours, alone, against 200 enemy soldiers, with one hand.
As the sun rose on May 13, 1945, an unnatural silence fell over the battlefield. For 4 hours it had been hell. Gunfire, explosions, screaming. Now, nothing but the sound of rain dripping from leaves and birds tentatively starting their morning songs. Naik Devbasing Bura and other Gurkhas rushed forward to Gurung's trench. They expected to find him dead. No one could survive that long under such intense attack while so badly wounded. It was impossible. But Lachhiman Gurung was alive, barely, sitting in his trench, surrounded by empty shell casings that brass littered the mud like copper flowers. His rifle lay across his lap. His kukri knife rested on the parapet within reach, unused but ready. His right hand was destroyed, just a mangled mess of blood and torn flesh. His right eye was gone. Blood covered his face, his uniform, his arms. He had bled so much that the bottom of the trench was dark with it. Shrapnel wounds dotted his body. Burns marked his skin. He was still conscious, still watching the jungle, still ready to fight if the Japanese came back. Bura and the others pulled him from the trench, gave him water. He drank desperately, not realizing how dehydrated he'd become. They applied field dressings to his wounds, but there were so many wounds they ran out of bandages. They had to prioritize, stop the worst bleeding first, deal with everything else later. The damage was catastrophic. His right hand would never function again. It was too destroyed to save. His right eye was gone, no possibility of recovery. Shrapnel was embedded throughout his body. Burns needed immediate treatment. He had lost massive amounts of blood. He should have died from blood loss alone. But he was alive, and his trench had held. The Japanese had failed to break through. The entire C Company perimeter was intact because one rifleman had refused to let them pass.
Medical evacuation came quickly. Gurung was carried to the rear on a stretcher. He kept trying to tell them he was fine, he could walk. They should leave him and go help someone else. The medics had to insist, "You're badly wounded, you need surgery, shut up, and let us save your life." Field surgeons worked on him for hours. They amputated what remained of his right hand. There was no saving it. They cleaned and dressed the eye socket where his right eye had been. They removed as many shrapnel fragments as they could find, though some were too deep, too dangerous to extract. Those would stay in his body for the rest of his life. They treated the burns, stitched the larger wounds, administered blood plasma and morphine. The surgeons kept shaking their heads. This man should be dead. By every medical standard, he should have died in that trench. But Gurkhas didn't follow medical standards. Gurkhas followed their own code, and that code said, "Never quit." While Gurung was being evacuated and treated, other Gurkhas examined the battlefield around his trench. What they found astonished even hardened combat veterans. 31 dead Japanese soldiers lay within a few yards of his position, 31 confirmed kills, all shot by one man with one hand in 4 hours of continuous combat. The physical evidence was undeniable. The bodies were there, the angles of fire were clear, the shell casings matched his weapon. Blood trails showed where wounded Japanese soldiers had been dragged away by their comrades. Equipment scattered across the ground, rifles, packs, helmets abandoned in retreat. The actual Japanese casualties were certainly higher than 31, but 31 could be confirmed, counted, documented. The mathematics of it were staggering. Gurung had started with approximately 60 rounds of ammunition. He had killed or wounded at least 50 enemy soldiers, possibly more. His accuracy under those impossible conditions exceeded what trained snipers achieve in controlled environments. And he had done it one-handed, half-blind, dying from blood loss, in pitch darkness, against an enemy that outnumbered him 50-1.
The recommendation for the Victoria Cross was immediate. Naik Div Basing Bora wrote a detailed report of what he had witnessed. His hands shook as he wrote it. Even putting the events into words seemed impossible. He described the grenade exploding in Gurung's hand, the catastrophic injuries, the 4 hours of solo combat, the 31 confirmed kills, the Japanese assault that should have succeeded but failed because one Gurkha refused to die. The company commander endorsed it immediately. Battalion command forwarded it up the chain. Brigade command read it and authorized the recommendation. Division command passed it to Army headquarters. Everyone who read it had the same reaction. If this is true, and the evidence says it is, this is the most remarkable act of individual courage in this entire campaign. The Victoria Cross is Britain's highest military decoration for gallantry. It's awarded only for most conspicuous bravery or some daring or preeminent act of valor or self-sacrifice or extreme devotion to duty in the presence of the enemy. Only 1,358 Victoria Crosses have ever been awarded since it was created in 1856. Only 13 have gone to Gurkhas in the regiment's entire history. If any action deserved it, Gurkhas did. One man holding an impossible position against overwhelming odds, fighting despite catastrophic wounds, never retreating, never surrendering, saving his entire company through sheer willpower and skill. The citation was approved and the award announced. On December 19, 1945, 7 months after his action, Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung stood at attention at the Red Fort in Delhi. Field Marshal Lord Wavell, Commander-in-Chief of India, personally pinned the Victoria Cross to his uniform. His elderly father, Parthiman Gurung, had traveled from their village in Nepal to witness the ceremony. At 74 years old, too frail to walk the distance, he had been carried for 11 days by villagers who wanted the old man to see his son receive Britain's highest honor. When Lachhiman saw his father in the crowd, the warrior who had faced 200 enemy soldiers without flinching broke down and wept. The official citation,
published in the London Gazette on August 9, 1945, read in part, "The citation didn't capture everything. It couldn't. How do you put 4 hours of hell into a paragraph? How do you describe pain beyond imagination? How do you quantify courage that defies human limits?" But the medal itself said everything that needed saying. The Victoria Cross. Britain recognized that what Lachhiman Gurung had done in that trench transcended normal heroism. It was something else, something that might never be repeated. Gurung recovered in military hospitals for months. The war ended while he was still being treated. Japan surrendered in August 1945. The Burma Campaign was over. Gurung would never see combat again. His fighting days were finished. But his service wasn't. After India gained independence in 1947, many Gurkha regiments transferred to the Indian Army. Gurung continued serving, rose to the rank of Havildar, sergeant, and only retired in 1969, 24 years after losing his hand and eye. He returned to Nepal, to his village, to his family. He married a woman named Manmaya, had 5 children, tried to build a normal life despite his disabilities. Farming with one hand was nearly impossible. Money was tight. The pension for Victoria Cross recipients was small. But Gurung never complained. He had done his duty. His brothers had survived because he held that trench. That was enough.
For decades, Gurung lived quietly in Nepal, but he never forgot his brothers in arms. The Gurkhas who had served Britain faithfully for nearly 2 centuries and were often forgotten when the wars ended. Gurkha soldiers had fought for Britain in every major conflict since 1815. They had died in their thousands defending the British Empire. But until 2004, Gurkhas who retired before 1997 received smaller pensions than British soldiers, sometimes just a third of what their British counterparts received for equivalent service. Worse, Gurkhas had no right to settle in Britain, even after serving for decades. They could die for Britain, but they couldn't live there. The injustice was profound. In the early 2000s, actress Joanna Lumley, whose father had served with Gurkha regiments, began campaigning for Gurkha rights. She brought media attention to the pension inequality and fought for the right of Gurkhas to settle in the UK. Lachhiman Gurung became a symbol of the campaign. Here was a man who had lost an eye and a hand defending Britain, who had earned the Victoria Cross, and he was living in poverty in a Nepali village, receiving a pittance in pension. In 1995, he was invited to London for Victoria Cross commemorations, marking the 50th anniversary of VE Day. It was his first time in Britain, the country he had bled for half a century earlier. He met with other VC recipients, was honoured by Queen Elizabeth II, and attended ceremonies at the Imperial War Museum. People wanted to hear his story. Journalists interviewed him. Historians documented his account. Everyone asked the same question. How did you do it? How did you keep fighting? Gurung's answers were always simple, almost frustratingly so. I was a Gurkha. I had my duty. I felt I was going to die anyway, so I might as well die standing on my feet. What else could I do? He returned to Nepal after the commemorations, but the campaign continued. In 1994, the British government partially addressed pension inequality. In 2008, after years of legal battles and public pressure, the government finally granted Gurkhas the right to settle in Britain. That same year, Gurung moved to Hounslow, West London. The borough of Hounslow made him a freeman, an honorary citizenship recognizing his extraordinary service. He lived there for the final years of his life, finally in the country he had defended so bravely.
Lachhiman Gurung died on December 12, 2010 in Hounslow. He was 92 years old. News of his death was mourned across Nepal and Britain. Military units honored his memory. Politicians issued statements. Media organizations covered his passing extensively. He was cremated according to Hindu tradition. His Victoria Cross medal was preserved and is now held by the Gurkha Museum in Winchester, England, where visitors can see it and learn his story. His obituaries retold the story one more time, how one rifleman had done what should have been impossible, how courage and duty had overcome injury and odds, how a Gurkha had shown the world what better to die than be a coward actually meant. But Gurung's legacy isn't just a medal in a museum or a story in history books. It lives on in every Gurkha who serves today. The 8th Gurkha Rifles is now part of the Indian Army. Every new recruit learns about Lachhiman Gurung. They hear the story of what he did on that night in May 1945. They understand what it means to be a Gurkha, not just the tactics and weapons, but the spirit, the refusal to quit, the devotion to duty, the willingness to die rather than fail your brothers. The Gurkha Museum in Winchester has an entire section dedicated to Victoria Cross recipients. Gurung's citation is displayed prominently. Visitors can see photographs of him, young and strong in his uniform before the war, older with his injuries visible, but his dignity intact. But perhaps the most important legacy is what his story represents. Lachhiman Gurung was not superhuman. Let's be very clear about that. He was 4'11", shorter than required, accepted only because Britain was desperate for soldiers. He came from crushing poverty in rural Nepal. He had no special advantages, no elite training, no advanced weapons. What he had was training, courage, and duty. When the moment came, when that grenade exploded in his hand and he had every rational reason to quit, he chose to keep fighting. Not because he was fearless, but because he accepted no alternative.
The Japanese soldiers who attacked his position that night were not cowards either. They were experienced, fanatical fighters who had conquered most of Asia. They outnumbered Gurung 50-1. They had every tactical advantage except one. They didn't have a Gurkha in their way. And that one Gurkha refused to let them pass, refused to die, refused to fail his duty. The Japanese couldn't understand it, couldn't overcome it, couldn't break through. 200 soldiers stopped by one wounded man who simply would not quit. Modern military academies study Gurung's action, trying to understand the psychology of it, trying to quantify the factors that allowed him to accomplish what he did. But the truth is simpler than the analysis. Gurung was trained, he was brave, he was committed to his brothers in arms. When the moment came, he did what Gurkhas have always done. He fought. He didn't calculate odds or consider alternatives. He had a job: hold the trench. So he held it. Everything else was irrelevant.
There's a temptation to view actions like Gurung's as aberrations, impossible feats that normal soldiers couldn't replicate. Gurung himself would reject that interpretation. He considered himself an ordinary Gurkha doing his duty. Nothing special, nothing superhuman, just a rifleman who refused to quit. His message to future generations is clear. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's fighting despite fear. Duty isn't following orders when it's easy, it's doing your job when it's impossible. Honor isn't winning, it's refusing to lose. The trench where Lachhiman Gurung made his stand no longer exists. The Burmese jungle has reclaimed that hillside. The battlefield is gone. The physical evidence has been eroded by time and weather. The exact location is lost, but the story remains. Passed down through Gurkha regiments, taught to new soldiers, remembered by historians, celebrated by a grateful Britain and Nepal. Inspiring anyone who hears it to ask themselves, if that man could do that, what could I do if I refused to quit? 31 dead Japanese soldiers,
4 hours of hell, 1 hand, 1 eye, 1 Gurkha who simply would not die. When people ask how he did it, the answer is both simple and profound. He was a Gurkha. Better to die than be a coward. On May 13, 1945, Lachhiman Gurung proved that maxim wasn't just words, it was reality. It was duty. It was who he was. The Japanese learned that lesson the hardest way possible. And the world learned what one man, with 1 hand, could accomplish when he simply refused to quit.
Today, if you visit the Gurkha Museum in Winchester, you can stand in front of Lachhiman Gurung's Victoria Cross. You can read his citation. You can see photographs of that young rifleman who stood 4 feet 11 inches tall and refused to let 200 enemy soldiers pass. The medal itself is simple. Bronze, unadorned, suspended from a crimson ribbon. The words, "For Valor," are stamped on the front. Nothing fancy, nothing elaborate, just like the man who earned it. But that simple medal represents something extraordinary. It represents a moment when one human being transcended normal limits through sheer force of will, when duty overcame injury, when courage defeated mathematics, when one became greater than 200. Lachhiman Gurung's story asks us a question we must all eventually answer. When the moment comes, when everything is on the line, when the odds are impossible, when we have every reason to quit, what will we do? Gurung answered that question on a rainy night in Burma in 1945. With 1 hand, 1 eye, and an unbreakable spirit, he showed the world what the human will can accomplish when it refuses to accept defeat. He was just a rifleman, just a Gurkha, just a man doing his duty. But on that night, duty was enough, courage was enough, and 1 man was enough. Lachhiman Gurung, Victoria Cross, 8th Gurkha Rifles. Better to die than be a coward.